Long before the nations of Teyvat took the shape we recognize today, the world existed in a far less organized state. There were no 7 nations. No archons presiding over clearly defined lands. No divine system that limited how many gods could rule the world. Instead, the continent was filled with countless divine beings, each claiming their own territory, their own followers, and their own vision for how the world should exist. This distant era existed thousands of years before the present events of Genshin Impact. It was a time when the boundary between mortals and gods was far thinner than it is today. Divine beings did not exist only in legend or scripture. They walked the land, ruled cities, and shaped the environments around them with their power. Across the world, different gods established domains in places that suited their nature. Some ruled mountains or forests. Others claimed rivers, valleys, deserts, or islands scattered across distant seas. These gods were not organized under a single system. They were not bound to specific regions by divine law, nor were they limited in number. If a powerful being emerged and gathered followers, it could simply become a god in the eyes of the people who lived beneath its protection. This meant the world of early Teyvat contained far more divine rulers than the 7 that exist today. In some regions, several gods ruled neighboring territories, each maintaining their own small kingdoms. In others, a powerful deity controlled a much larger domain, commanding the loyalty of multiple human settlements at once. For the people of this era, life was often defined by their relationship with the god who governed their land. Some deities were protectors who genuinely cared for the well-being of the humans under their rule. These gods used their power to create safe environments where their followers could thrive. They might calm storms, enrich the soil, or defend their territory from outside threats. Other gods ruled more harshly. For them, human followers were less like citizens and more like subjects meant to strengthen their power. Worship increased a god's influence, and influence often translated directly into strength. Because of this, many gods sought to expand their number of followers whenever possible. As a result, the boundaries between divine territories were rarely stable. A god who wished to expand their domain might encourage their followers to settle nearby lands. Another might challenge a rival deity directly, seeking to overthrow them and claim their people. In a world filled with countless divine rulers, conflict was almost inevitable. Yet despite this instability, many human civilizations still managed to develop and grow. Early cities appeared across the continent, often built in places where the protection of a god made life safer. These settlements gradually developed their own cultures, traditions, and beliefs, all shaped by the deity they served. Over time, entire societies formed around the ideals of their patron god. Some valued strength, others valued wisdom, freedom, or order. But even in this age of countless divine powers, there was still something watching from above. Far beyond the lands of Teyvat, high in the sky where mortals could not reach, existed a place known as Celestia. Celestia appeared as a floating island suspended in the heavens, distant and mysterious. While its true nature remained largely unknown to the people below, one fact slowly became clear throughout ancient history. Celestia held authority over the divine order of the world. And although it rarely interfered directly in the affairs of gods and mortals, its influence would eventually reshape the entire structure of power across Teyvat. At first, however, life continued much as it always had. Gods ruled their lands. Humans built civilizations beneath them. And the balance of power across the continent constantly shifted as new deities rose and others faded into obscurity. But this fragile balance could not last forever, because the existence of countless independent gods created a world that was powerful, but also dangerously unstable. And eventually, the forces that watched over Teyvat would decide that the world needed a new order, one that would change the fate of every god who ruled the land. In this ancient age, the presence of gods shaped nearly every aspect of life in Teyvat. Human civilizations did not develop independently from divine influence. Instead, most societies grew directly beneath the protection, guidance, or control of the deity who ruled their land. To the people of these early settlements, their god was often the most powerful and constant force in their world. If crops flourished, it was because their god had blessed the soil. If storms destroyed villages or floods swallowed fields, it was often interpreted as a sign of divine anger. Because of this, faith and survival were deeply connected. Worship was not merely spiritual devotion. It was often seen as a practical necessity for maintaining the favor of the powerful being who governed the land. But the relationship between gods and humans varied greatly depending on the nature of the deity who ruled a particular region. Some gods genuinely protected humanity. These deities helped their followers build stable communities, offering guidance and protection against both natural disasters and hostile forces. Under such gods, human settlements could grow steadily, developing culture, art, and traditions that reflected the ideals of their divine protector. Other gods were far less benevolent. Some demanded constant offerings, tributes, or strict obedience. Their rule could be harsh and absolute, with mortals expected to serve the gods' will without question. In regions governed by such deities, life could become difficult, shaped by fear rather than trust. Yet regardless of whether a god ruled with kindness or cruelty, the existence of so many divine beings meant that humanity's fate was often determined by forces far beyond their control. Entire civilizations could rise or fall depending on the decisions of the god they followed. If a god was defeated in battle, their people might suddenly find themselves abandoned or conquered. If a god chose to expand their territory, nearby settlements might be forced to pledge loyalty to a new ruler. In this way, the world of early Teyvat was constantly shifting. Divine power defined the boundaries of nations long before human governments ever existed. But the gods themselves were not immune to conflict. With so many divine beings scattered across the continent, rivalries inevitably formed. Some gods desired greater influence and sought to expand their domains. Others simply fought to defend the lands they already possessed. These conflicts were not always small or isolated. When gods fought, the consequences could reshape entire landscapes. Mountains might crumble under the force of divine power. Storms could rage for days without rest. Rivers might change their course as the land itself shifted beneath the clash of supernatural forces. For humans living nearby, these battles were often catastrophic. Cities built under the protection of one god might suddenly find themselves caught between two rival powers. Entire settlements could be destroyed in moments, their people scattered or forced to flee to safer lands. Over time, these repeated conflicts created a world where stability was difficult to maintain. While some regions experienced long periods of peace under powerful and capable gods, other areas were constantly caught in cycles of war and destruction. And yet, despite the chaos that sometimes accompanied divine rivalries, the number of gods across Teyvat continued to grow. New divine beings occasionally emerged, either through mysterious origins or through the accumulation of power and worship over time. As these new gods established themselves, the balance of power across the continent became even more complicated. The world was becoming increasingly crowded with divine rulers. Each god had their own ambitions. Each commanded their own followers. And many believed that their vision for the world was the one that should ultimately prevail. For a time, this system continued without any clear limit. But high above the world, Celestia watched. Celestia had always existed beyond the reach of mortals, floating silently in the sky like a distant observer of the world below. Its true nature remained a mystery even to many of the gods themselves. What was known, however, was that Celestia possessed authority over the divine order of Teyvat. It represented a higher level of power, one that even the strongest gods could not ignore. Throughout ancient history, Celestia rarely intervened directly in the affairs of the world. Gods rose and fell, civilizations formed and vanished, and the continent's balance of power shifted countless times. Yet despite this distance, it was clear that Celestia continued to watch. And as the number of gods across Teyvat continued to grow, the instability of the world became increasingly difficult to ignore. A world ruled by countless independent deities was powerful, but it was also unpredictable. Territories constantly changed hands. Divine conflicts could erupt without warning, and the fate of entire civilizations depended on which god happened to rule their land. Eventually, the forces that governed the heavens would decide that this system could not continue forever. The world would need a new order, an order that limited divine rule, an order that would determine which gods would shape the future of Teyvat, and which would disappear from history. As the centuries passed, the growing number of gods across Teyvat began to shape the world in increasingly complex ways. Each divine ruler governed their territory according to their own ideals. Some valued harmony between mortals and nature. Others prioritized strength, loyalty, or absolute control. These differing philosophies gradually gave rise to distinct cultures among the human societies that lived beneath each god's protection. Over time, the influence of these deities became deeply embedded in the development of early civilizations. Cities were designed around temples dedicated to the local god. Festivals were held in honor of divine victories or blessings. Entire traditions and systems of belief emerged as communities attempted to understand and honor the powerful beings who shaped their lives. For many people, their god was not simply a distant ruler. They were a living symbol of stability, a protector whose presence ensured that their land remained safe from outside threats. But this sense of security depended entirely on the continued strength of that god. If a deity weakened, disappeared, or was defeated by a rival, the consequences for their followers could be devastating. History records many instances where the fall of a god led to the collapse of the civilization they had protected. Without the power that had once defended them, cities could quickly become vulnerable to natural disasters, invading forces, or the influence of rival deities seeking to expand their domain. Because of this, loyalty between gods and their followers often ran deep. Humans prayed for the strength of their patron deity, believing that their survival depended on it. And in many cases, that belief was not entirely misplaced. A god's influence was often strengthened by the devotion of the people who worshipped them. The more followers a god had, the greater their reach across the land. This relationship created a powerful cycle. Gods protected their people. People worshipped their gods. And through that worship, the gods themselves grew stronger. Yet this cycle also intensified competition between divine rulers. If a god wished to expand their influence, gaining new followers was one of the most effective ways to do so. That meant extending their territory into lands already ruled by another deity. And when two gods claimed the same region, conflict often followed. These divine struggles were not always direct battles between gods themselves. Sometimes they unfolded slowly, through shifting alliances and changing loyalties among human settlements. A city might abandon its former god and begin worshipping another who promised greater protection. A rival deity might send storms or disasters as warnings to neighboring lands. And in other cases, the gods themselves would confront one another directly, unleashing their power in battles that could reshape entire regions. Through these countless rivalries, the political landscape of Teyvat became increasingly unstable. Some gods rose rapidly, gaining large territories and powerful followings. Others faded into obscurity as their influence weakened. Entire divine kingdoms appeared and vanished over the course of centuries. From the perspective of humanity, the world often felt unpredictable. The god who protected your homeland today might not remain victorious tomorrow. And as more divine beings entered the struggle for power, the number of potential conflicts continued to grow. For a time, the world continued to exist in this delicate balance. But far above the lands of Teyvat, the silent observers of Celestia had begun to recognize a fundamental problem. The system that governed the world had no limits. As long as new gods could emerge and claim territory, the number of divine rulers would continue to grow indefinitely. And with every new god who entered the stage, the risk of further conflict increased. If nothing changed, the world might eventually become trapped in endless cycles of divine warfare. A land where no lasting peace could ever be established. At some point in this distant era, the powers of Celestia appear to have reached a conclusion. The world required structure. The authority of gods needed to be limited. And the balance of power across Teyvat needed to be reshaped into something far more stable. What followed would become one of the most defining moments in the history of the world. A decision that would determine which gods would continue to rule, and which would be erased from the future of Teyvat entirely. But before that transformation could take place, the world would first be forced into a conflict unlike anything it had experienced before. Because the new order that Celestia intended to establish would only allow for a very small number of divine rulers to remain. 7, to be exact. And every god who wished to survive would have to fight for that place. By this point in history, the world of Teyvat had reached a strange and fragile equilibrium. Countless gods ruled across the continent, each holding authority over their own followers and territories. Some governed small valleys or islands, their influence limited but stable. Others commanded far larger domains, their power stretching across mountains, forests, and wide plains. To the people living under them, these gods were simply part of the natural order of the world. Human civilizations had grown alongside divine rulers for generations. Cities had been built around temples. Laws had been shaped by the ideals of local gods. Entire cultures had formed around the belief that their deity would guide and protect them for as long as they remained loyal. But while life beneath many of these gods could appear stable on the surface, the world itself remained deeply unstable. There were simply too many divine powers competing for influence. As centuries passed, rivalries between gods continued to grow more intense. When a powerful deity expanded their territory, neighboring gods often viewed it as a threat to their own survival. Even small disputes could escalate quickly when divine pride and power were involved. And because gods were capable of shaping the natural world itself, their conflicts could leave permanent marks upon the land. Mountains could collapse. Storms could rage across entire regions. Seas could churn violently for days without rest. These events were not merely natural disasters. They were often the aftermath of battles between divine beings whose power dwarfed anything humanity could hope to resist. For mortals, survival during this age required constant adaptation. Cities might flourish for generations beneath the protection of a powerful god, only to be forced into sudden migration if that god fell in battle. Entire communities sometimes vanished from the historical record when their divine protector disappeared. Even so, humanity continued to endure. People rebuilt their homes. New settlements were established. Cultures evolved as generations adapted to the ever-changing landscape shaped by divine conflict. But from a broader perspective, the world was becoming increasingly chaotic. The number of gods continued to grow. The boundaries between their territories remained fluid. And the absence of a central divine authority meant that no lasting peace could ever truly exist. High above the world, Celestia had watched this cycle unfold for centuries. Though distant and rarely seen, its presence had always lingered in the sky as a reminder that a higher order existed beyond the world below. The floating island remained far beyond the reach of mortals, silent and unmoving, yet unmistakably real. To many across Teyvat, Celestia represented the ultimate seat of divine power. It was believed to be the place where gods could ascend, where chosen individuals might one day rise beyond the mortal world. Even in ancient times, its existence suggested that some form of higher authority governed the fate of both gods and humans. And eventually, that authority would act. The growing instability of a world filled with countless divine rulers could not continue indefinitely. A system with no limits would only produce endless conflict. As more gods appeared and rivalries deepened, the risk of permanent chaos across Teyvat became impossible to ignore. At some point in this distant era, a new order began to take shape. Celestia would establish a system that would permanently reshape the balance of power across the world. Rather than allowing countless gods to rule scattered territories, the world would instead be governed by a far smaller number of divine authorities. 7 gods, each representing one of the fundamental elements that defined the natural world. Each chosen to rule a specific region of Teyvat. These gods would become known as the Archons. But there was one unavoidable consequence to this new system. If only 7 gods could rule the world, then every other god would have to fall. And so, what had once been a loosely connected world of independent divine rulers was about to become something far more dangerous. A battlefield. Across the continent, gods would soon begin to fight not just for territory or influence, but for survival itself. Because the coming conflict would decide the fate of every divine being in Teyvat. Only 7 would remain. And the war that would determine those victors would become one of the most devastating eras in the history of the world. It would be remembered as the Archon War. The decision that would reshape the world of Teyvat did not arrive with a single visible announcement. There was no moment where the skies parted and a voice from Celestia spoke clearly to every god across the land. No ancient record describes a grand declaration delivered to the divine rulers of the world. Instead, what history reveals is something quieter, but far more profound. At some point in the distant past, the structure of divine authority began to change. For countless centuries, gods had ruled freely across Teyvat. Their power had come from their own strength, their followers, and the territories they controlled. But now, a new system was emerging. A system that would recognize only 7 gods as the true rulers of the world. These chosen deities would come to be known as the Archons. Each Archon would represent one of the 7 elements that shaped the natural forces of Teyvat. Each would rule over a specific region, establishing a divine authority that would define that nation for thousands of years to come. This was the beginning of the order that still governs the world in the present day of Genshin Impact. But when this system first appeared, it created a problem that could not be ignored, because the world already contained far more than 7 gods. Across mountains, valleys, forests, deserts, and seas, countless divine beings ruled over their own followers and territories. Many of them had existed for centuries, building civilizations that depended on their power and protection. If only 7 gods could ultimately hold the title of Archon, then every other god in Teyvat would face the same harsh reality. They would either have to defeat their rivals, or disappear. And so, slowly at first, the world began to change. Rivalries between gods that had once been limited to small territorial disputes now carried far greater consequences. A conflict between 2 deities was no longer simply about land or influence. It had become a struggle for survival. Gods who had once ruled peacefully now found themselves forced to consider a dangerous future. If they did nothing, a rival deity might rise in strength and claim the title of Archon instead. If that happened, the defeated god could lose everything. Their territory, their followers, even their existence. Because history shows that many of the gods who lost these ancient conflicts did not simply retreat into obscurity. Many were destroyed. Others vanished entirely, their names fading from memory as the centuries passed. And so, the age of scattered divine rule began to give way to something far more violent. The Archon War had begun. Unlike a single battlefield where armies clash in one decisive campaign, the Archon War unfolded across the entire world at once. Different regions experienced their own conflicts, shaped by the gods who ruled those lands. In some places, alliances formed between divine beings who hoped to survive the coming chaos together. In others, powerful gods challenged every rival they could find, seeking to eliminate competition as quickly as possible. Human civilizations soon found themselves caught in the middle of these struggles. For many communities, loyalty to their god meant standing beside them in a conflict they could barely understand. Cities were fortified. Followers prayed for their deity's victory, knowing that the fate of their entire civilization might depend on it. But even the most devoted human armies could do little to influence battles between gods. When divine power was unleashed, the landscape itself often became the battlefield. Storms powerful enough to flatten forests, earthquakes that shattered mountains, floods that erased entire valleys. These were the kinds of forces that accompanied the clashes of ancient deities. As these conflicts spread across Teyvat, the number of gods ruling the world slowly began to decline. Some were defeated in direct battle. Others lost their followers and faded away as their power diminished. A few chose to withdraw from the struggle entirely, abandoning their territories rather than risk destruction. But the war did not slow. If anything, the disappearance of weaker gods only intensified the competition between the ones who remained. Because every fallen deity meant one less rival standing between a survivor and the title of Archon. Over time, powerful figures began to emerge from the chaos. Gods whose strength, leadership, or vision allowed them to endure the brutal conflicts spreading across the land. Some would rise as protectors of humanity. Others would become feared conquerors whose victories reshaped entire regions. And in several parts of the world, the battles that unfolded during this era would eventually become legendary stories passed down through generations. One of those stories would take place in a land surrounded by endless winds. A city ruled by a god of storms. A kingdom protected by towering walls of wind that no ordinary person could cross. And within that city, a quiet rebellion was beginning to take shape. Because even among gods, power alone could not guarantee loyalty. And in the land that would one day become Mondstadt, the rule of a storm god was about to face its greatest challenge. As the Archon War spread across Teyvat, the balance that had once allowed countless gods to coexist slowly began to collapse. In earlier centuries, conflicts between divine beings had certainly existed, but they had often been limited in scope. A dispute might arise over a stretch of territory, a group of followers, or a valuable region rich in resources. While such battles could be destructive, They were usually isolated events rather than part of a larger struggle. The creation of the Archon system changed that completely. Now every conflict between gods carried the weight of a much larger question. Who would survive long enough to claim one of the 7 thrones of divine authority? And who would vanish from history forever? This realization spread gradually among the divine rulers of Teyvat. Some gods understood the implications quickly and began preparing for war. Others resisted the idea at first, believing that their domains were secure enough to avoid conflict. But as more deities disappeared from the world, the truth became impossible to ignore. The number of gods ruling Teyvat was shrinking, and the remaining ones were becoming stronger. Each victory in battle allowed a god to claim new territory and new followers. Their influence expanded, their power grew, and their position in the struggle for archonhood became more secure. This created a dangerous cycle. The stronger a god became, the more threatening they appeared to their rivals. And the more rivals they had, the more likely it was that another conflict would erupt. In many regions, the war unfolded slowly, with decades or even centuries passing between major divine confrontations. Alliances formed between gods who hoped to protect their territories together. Temporary peace agreements allowed civilizations to rebuild after devastating battles. But these moments of calm rarely lasted, because the Archon War was not a conflict that could end through negotiation. As long as more than 7 gods remained in the world, the struggle would continue. In some cases, the disappearance of a god occurred in ways that left little trace behind. Ancient records sometimes speak of divine beings who simply faded from history. Their temples fell into ruin, their followers dispersed, and over time even their names were forgotten. Whether these gods were defeated in hidden battles or abandoned their territories in fear is often impossible to know. Other confrontations, however, left far more dramatic marks on the world. Certain regions of Teyvat still bear the scars of these ancient wars. Mountains split by divine power. Storm-swept landscapes that seem permanently altered. Ruins buried beneath centuries of earth and stone. These remnants serve as silent reminders of a time when gods clashed openly for control of the world. Throughout these conflicts, humanity struggled to survive in the shadow of forces far beyond their control. For many people, the Archon War was not an abstract struggle between divine rulers. It was a series of disasters that could change their lives overnight. A city protected by a powerful god might thrive for generations, only to be destroyed when that deity fell to a rival. Entire populations sometimes fled their homelands when divine battles threatened to consume their territory. Some communities chose to follow their god into war, believing that loyalty would ensure their survival. Others abandoned their former rulers, seeking refuge under the protection of stronger deities. These shifting allegiances further complicated the balance of power between the gods themselves, because followers were more than just subjects. They were a source of strength. The devotion of worshippers often played a role in sustaining a god's influence across the land. Losing followers could weaken a deity, while gaining new ones could strengthen them considerably. This meant that the Archon War was fought not only through divine power, but also through the hearts and loyalty of the people who lived beneath the god's rule. As the war continued, certain divine figures began to stand out among the countless competitors. Some proved to be exceptional leaders, capable of guiding both their followers and their allies through the chaos of the conflict. Others possessed overwhelming power that allowed them to defeat rival gods directly. Over time, these powerful figures would shape the future of entire regions. But the path to becoming an Archon was never easy. Every victory created new enemies. Every expansion of territory brought new rivals who feared the rise of a potential Archon. And in several parts of the world, the struggle for power produced stories that would be remembered for thousands of years. One such story would unfold in the windswept land of the north. There, a god had already established a powerful kingdom surrounded by towering storms. His rule appeared unchallenged. His city was protected by winds so strong that no ordinary traveler could pass through them. For generations, the people within those walls had lived under the authority of that storm god. But beyond the walls, the winds of change were already beginning to stir. Because the Archon War was not only a contest of strength between gods, it was also a test of the ideals they represented. And in the land that would one day be called Mondstadt, those ideals were about to collide in a way that would change the fate of an entire nation. Among all the regions affected by the Archon War, the land that would eventually become Mondstadt offers one of the clearest stories of how the conflict reshaped the world. Long before the City of Freedom existed, this northern land was a far harsher place. Powerful winds swept constantly across the plains and mountains, shaping the environment and isolating many settlements from one another. Life here was difficult, and survival often depended on the protection of the god who ruled the region. At the center of this early civilization stood a powerful deity known as Dekarabian. Dekarabian was a god of immense strength who controlled the winds themselves. Using that power, he established a great city surrounded by towering storms. These winds formed an enormous barrier that encircled his domain, protecting it from the dangers of the outside world. Within this storm wall, a thriving civilization developed. To many of Dekarabian's followers, the barrier was a blessing. Outside the walls, the wilderness of early Teyvat remained unpredictable and dangerous, especially during the chaotic years of the Archon War. The storms that surrounded the city shielded its inhabitants from both natural threats and rival gods who might have sought to invade. But what had begun as protection slowly became something else. A prison. The winds surrounding the city were not gentle breezes that people could easily pass through. They were violent storms, powerful enough to prevent anyone from leaving. Over time, the people who lived inside Dekarabian's kingdom realized that they were not free to explore the world beyond the storm walls. Their god had sealed them inside his domain. From Dekarabian's perspective, this may have seemed like an act of care. By keeping his followers within the protected city, he could ensure their safety during a time when the world outside was filled with conflict between rival gods. But to the people themselves, life inside the storm barrier began to feel suffocating. The skies above the city were always filled with the roaring winds created by their ruler. The outside world was hidden beyond an endless wall of storms, leaving the people with little knowledge of what lay beyond their isolated kingdom. Over generations, the idea of freedom slowly faded. Many citizens simply accepted the world they had been given. After all, the city remained prosperous and safe compared to the chaos that plagued other parts of Teyvat during the Archon War. Yet not everyone was content with this life. Among the people of Dekarabian's city, some began to dream of a world beyond the storm barrier. They imagined lands where the winds did not trap them within stone walls. A world where humans could walk freely across open plains beneath clear skies. These quiet dreams would eventually grow into something far more powerful. A rebellion. But the story of Mondstadt's transformation cannot be told through human determination alone. Because even within the winds of Dekarabian's storm-filled kingdom, another power had begun to stir. A small elemental being born from the very winds that filled the skies. This being was not a mighty god commanding vast territories. It possessed none of the overwhelming authority that divine rulers like Dekarabian held over their lands. At the time, it was little more than a wandering wind spirit. But over time, this spirit would come to embody the ideals that the people trapped inside the storm walls had begun to crave. Freedom. In the centuries to come, that humble wind spirit would rise to become one of the most influential figures in the history of Teyvat. The being who would one day be known as the Anemo Archon, Barbatos. But before that transformation could occur, the winds of Mondstadt would have to change forever. And the people trapped within Dekarabian's kingdom would soon discover that even the might of a storm god could not silence the desire for freedom forever. Inside the storm walls of Dekarabian's kingdom, life continued much as it had for generations. The great city remained protected from the dangers of the outside world. The winds that surrounded it still roared endlessly, forming an impenetrable barrier that separated the people within from the rest of Teyvat. To outsiders, the city was nearly impossible to reach. And to those who lived inside, leaving was equally impossible. The people had been born into this isolated world, raised beneath skies that were never calm and walls that no one could cross. For many, this life felt normal. It was the only world they had ever known. But as the Archon War continued to reshape the continent beyond those storms, new ideas began to take root among the people of the city. Some began to question whether their god's protection truly served their interests. The winds that shielded them from danger also prevented them from exploring the wider world. Stories from travelers were rare, but when they appeared, they hinted at lands far beyond the storm barrier. Lands with open skies, distant mountains, and horizons that stretched endlessly. These stories stirred something powerful within the hearts of a few individuals. Among them was a young man whose name has never been preserved in history. Today, he is remembered only by a title: the Nameless Bard. This bard was known for his music, for the songs he sang about the world beyond the storm walls. While most citizens had never seen those distant lands for themselves, the bard's songs painted vivid images of freedom. He sang about the wind not as a prison, but as something meant to carry people across open skies. To many listeners, these songs were simply beautiful stories. But to others, they became a quiet reminder of something the people had never truly possessed: the freedom to choose their own path. The bard was not alone in his dreams of a different world. Around him gathered a small group of companions who shared his belief that the storm walls surrounding the city were not a gift, but a cage. They believed that humanity should not live under such confinement, even if it came from a god. At the same time, the winds that filled the skies above the city carried another presence. A small wind spirit had begun to follow the bard and his companions. This spirit was drawn to the songs that spoke of freedom and open skies. Though it was only a minor elemental being at the time, it seemed to understand the meaning behind the bard's music. The wind spirit listened. It watched. And slowly, it began to care for the people who dreamed of a world beyond Decarabian's storm barrier. This bond between the wind spirit and the human rebels would prove far more important than anyone could have imagined. Because as the Archon War continued across Teyvat, even the powerful storm god who ruled Mondstadt could not remain untouched by the changes unfolding in the world. Decarabian believed that his storm walls protected his people, but he did not understand the hearts of those who lived within them. He could command the winds. He could reshape the skies themselves, but he could not command the human desire for freedom. And as the years passed, the quiet resistance within the city began to grow stronger. The bard's song spread from one corner of the city to another. More people began to listen, imagining the possibility of a world without the storm walls that surrounded them. The rebellion did not begin with weapons. It began with hope. Hope that one day the winds might carry them beyond the prison that their god had built. Yet the path toward that freedom would not come without sacrifice. Because when the rebellion finally rose against the storm god of Mondstadt, it would trigger one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Archon War. A battle between the ruler of the storm-filled city and the winds that had begun to defy him. And when that battle ended, the fate of Mondstadt would change forever. The rebellion against the storm god did not appear suddenly. For years, perhaps even generations, dissatisfaction had quietly grown among the people who lived inside Decarabian's storm-filled kingdom. The winds that once symbolized protection had become a constant reminder that the people within the city were cut off from the rest of the world. And while many citizens continued to live their lives without questioning the system that surrounded them, others could no longer ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. At the center of this quiet resistance stood the Nameless Bard. Through music and storytelling, he gave voice to the dreams that many people had long kept hidden. His songs described a world beyond the storm barrier, a place where the wind did not trap people inside towering walls, but instead carried them freely across the skies. To those who listened, the bard's music awakened something powerful: the idea that humans were meant to live freely. That belief slowly spread throughout the city, passing from person to person until it reached far beyond the small group of rebels who first shared the dream. And beside them, always listening to the songs, was the small wind spirit that had become their quiet companion. This spirit had no kingdom, no armies, and no grand authority over the land. Compared to a powerful deity like Decarabian, it was insignificant. But the spirit understood something that the storm god did not. It understood the meaning of freedom. The wind itself was never meant to be confined. It flowed across mountains, valleys, and oceans without restraint. It moved wherever it wished, shaping the world through movement rather than control. And as the wind spirit listened to the bard's songs, it began to realize that the people of the city longed for that same freedom. Eventually, the quiet resistance within the storm walls could no longer remain hidden. The rebellion began. Historical records of this moment are fragmented, but the story has been preserved through legends and ancient accounts that describe the people rising against the god who ruled them. The rebellion was not simply a human uprising. It became something far greater. The wind spirit who had followed the rebels chose to stand with them. In doing so, the spirit began to transform. The ideals carried by the nameless bard and his companions resonated with the very nature of the wind itself. As their rebellion grew, the spirit's power grew alongside it, shaped by the hopes and determination of the people who believed in freedom. This change marked the beginning of the rise of the being who would eventually become the Anemo Archon, Barbatos. But the storm god who ruled the city would not surrender his power easily. When the rebellion reached its peak, the forces of Decarabian moved to crush the uprising. The winds surrounding the city roared with even greater fury, as though the storm itself had awakened in anger. What followed was one of the most dramatic battles of the Archon War. Within the storm walls, the rebels and their divine ally challenged the authority of a god who had ruled the land for generations. The nameless bard fought alongside his companions, believing that the dream of freedom was worth any sacrifice. And during the chaos of the battle, that sacrifice would come. The bard who had inspired the rebellion did not survive the conflict. Though the details of his final moments are unclear, the legends of Mondstadt remember him as a hero whose dream of freedom helped bring down a god. His death would leave a lasting mark on the wind spirit who had fought beside him. Because when the battle finally ended, and the storm god fell, the spirit would choose to carry the bard's memory into the future. But first, the storm walls themselves had to fall. And when they did, the skies above Mondstadt would change forever. The final moments of the rebellion were marked by a clash that would forever change the winds of northern Teyvat. For generations, Decarabian had ruled from the center of his storm-bound kingdom. His control over the winds had allowed him to shape the environment itself, creating towering walls of wind that sealed his city away from the outside world. Within those walls, his authority had gone unchallenged for centuries. But the rebellion had revealed something the storm god had never fully understood. Power alone could not secure the loyalty of those who longed for freedom. As the battle within the storm city reached its height, the winds themselves began to shift. The small spirit that had once followed the nameless bard had grown far stronger during the conflict. Empowered by the hopes of the rebels and the ideals they fought for, that spirit had become something far more powerful than the wandering elemental being it once was. It had become the embodiment of the freedom the people desired. The confrontation between the storm god and the rising wind spirit marked the turning point of Mondstadt's fate. Though Decarabian's power over the winds was immense, the rebellion had weakened his control over the very domain he believed belonged entirely to him. The storm walls that once protected the city now became unstable. The winds that had always obeyed Decarabian began to slip from his command. And as the battle continued, the storm god was finally defeated. With the fall of Decarabian, the winds surrounding the city began to collapse. The enormous barrier that had imprisoned the people for generations slowly faded, allowing the skies above Mondstadt to clear for the first time in centuries. For the people who survived the battle, the change must have been overwhelming. The endless storm that had once filled the heavens was gone. Above them stretched an open sky. For the first time, the citizens of the city could see beyond the walls that had confined them. The world outside their isolated kingdom lay before them, vast and unknown. The dream that the nameless bard had once sung about had finally become reality. But the rebellion had come at a cost. The bard himself had not lived to see the new world his songs had helped create. His death left a deep impression on the wind spirit who had fought beside him throughout the conflict. In honor of the bard's sacrifice, the spirit made a decision that would shape the future of Mondstadt. Rather than rule as a distant or imposing god, the spirit chose to take on a form inspired by the human who had first taught it the meaning of freedom. The wind spirit adopted the appearance of the nameless bard. In doing so, it carried the memory of that young rebel into the new age that had just begun. From that moment forward, the spirit would be known by a new name, Barbatos. With Decarabian gone and the storm walls destroyed, Barbatos became the divine ruler of the land that would one day be called Mondstadt. Unlike the storm god who came before him, however, Barbatos had no desire to govern his people through control or confinement. The ideals of the rebellion had shaped him. He believed that humans should guide their own destiny. And so, rather than rule with strict authority, Barbatos allowed the people of Mondstadt to build their society around the principle of freedom. This philosophy would eventually become the defining trait of the nation. While the Archon War continued to rage across the rest of Teyvat, Mondstadt had already taken its first step toward becoming something different from the other lands shaped by the conflict. A nation where the wind was not a prison, but a symbol of freedom. Yet the war itself was far from over. Across the continent, other gods still fought for survival, and the struggle for the remaining positions among the Seven Archons continued. One of the longest and most brutal conflicts of the Archon War would unfold far to the south, in a land of mountains and stone. A land where contracts held great power, and where one of the most enduring gods in Teyvat would slowly rise above all his rivals. The story of that land begins with a deity whose influence would shape the history of an entire nation. Morax. Far to the south of Mondstadt, beyond long mountain ranges and deep valleys carved by ancient rivers, lay a land that would one day become one of the most prosperous nations in all of Teyvat. This land was Liyue. Long before its famous harbor existed, Liyue was already a region rich with life and opportunity. Vast stone forests rose from the earth like the pillars of a forgotten world. Rivers flowed from the mountains toward the sea, creating fertile valleys where early human communities could settle. But during the age of the Archon War, this same landscape became one of the most contested regions on the entire continent. Because Liyue was not ruled by a single god. It was ruled by many. Ancient texts and surviving legends suggest that the region was once home to numerous divine beings who controlled different parts of the land. Some governed the mountains. Others claimed the rivers, the plains, or the coastline. Each god possessed their own followers. Each maintained their own territory. And like the rest of Teyvat, they were eventually drawn into the growing storm of the Archon War. As the conflict spread across the world, the fragile balance that once allowed these gods to coexist began to break apart. Rivalries that had once been manageable suddenly became matters of survival. Territories that had once been respected as sacred domains became targets for expansion. And the presence of so many divine rulers in a single region meant that the war in Liyue would become particularly intense. Among these many gods, one figure gradually began to stand apart from the rest. This god was known as Morax. Unlike some deities who ruled through overwhelming force or fear, Morax was known for his discipline, his sense of order, and his commitment to agreements. Even in the earliest surviving stories about him, he is described as a warrior who valued structure and responsibility. These qualities would later become the foundation of Liyue's culture. But during the Archon War, they also made Morax a formidable opponent. Because while many gods fought impulsively, Morax approached conflict with careful planning and long-term strategy. He did not seek battle without purpose. When he fought, it was usually to protect the people who had chosen to live under his protection. And as the war continued, more and more communities began to gather under his banner. Morax was not alone in shaping the early history of Liyue. Among the many gods who lived in the region, one in particular became his closest ally. Her name was Guizhong. Guizhong was a goddess known for her wisdom and her extraordinary talent for invention. While Morax was a warrior and a strategist, Guizhong was a thinker. She devoted much of her time to studying mechanisms, engineering, and the mysteries of the natural world. Where Morax brought strength and stability, Guizhong brought creativity and knowledge. Together, the two gods shared a similar vision for the future of humanity. Rather than ruling their followers through fear, they wanted to build a civilization where humans could develop safely under divine protection. This idea was unusual during the Archon War. Many gods demanded absolute devotion from their followers. Some treated human settlements primarily as sources of worship and power. But Morax and Guizhong believed that humans could become something more. They believed that with guidance and protection, humanity could build lasting societies of their own. And so the two gods worked together to establish one of the earliest organized human civilizations in the region. This settlement arose in a broad and fertile area between Liyue's mountain ranges. Over time, it became known as Gili Plains. The name itself reflected the partnership between its two founders. Gue came from Guizhong. Li came from Morax. Together, the land became known as Gili. The civilization that developed there is often referred to in historical accounts as the Gili Assembly. For a time, it became one of the most advanced and stable communities in the region. Humans gathered there in large numbers. Farms spread across the plains. Stone structures were built to house growing populations. And under Guizhong's guidance, knowledge began to flourish. Guizhong herself created numerous mechanical devices intended to help defend the settlement from outside threats. Among the most famous of these inventions was the Guizhong ballista. This massive mechanical weapon was designed to launch enormous bolts across vast distances. Even by modern standards, it was an impressive piece of engineering. Centuries later, weapons inspired by Guizhong's designs would still be used to defend Liyue harbor from powerful enemies. But during the Archon War, the ballista represented something even more important. It showed that humans and gods working together could create powerful tools to protect civilization. For a while, the Gili assembly thrived. Protected by Morax and guided by Guizhong, the people living there experienced a rare period of stability in the middle of an otherwise chaotic era. But the Archon War was not a conflict that allowed peaceful places to remain untouched forever. Because as other gods across Liyue fought for survival, the growing strength of the Gili assembly began to attract attention. To rival deities, the alliance between Morax and Guizhong represented a dangerous development. Their territory was expanding, their population was growing, and their influence over the region was becoming impossible to ignore. Eventually, the war reached the plains. The exact details of what happened during the fall of the Gili assembly are lost to history. Ancient records speak only in fragments. What they agree on, however, is that the plains became a battlefield during the Archon War. Powerful forces clashed across the land. The machines that once defended the settlement were damaged or destroyed. Buildings collapsed. The once prosperous plains were reduced to ruins. During this conflict, Guizhong was killed. The death of Guizhong became one of the most tragic moments in Liyue's ancient history. Later stories suggest that Morax was present during her final moments. But whatever words were spoken between them were never recorded. What is certain is that after Guizhong's death, the Gili assembly could no longer survive. The people who had lived there were forced to abandon the plains. Under Morax's protection, the survivors began migrating south toward the coastline. There, between the mountains and the sea, they would begin building a new home. A settlement that would eventually grow into Liyue harbor. But even as the people of Liyue tried to rebuild their lives, the Archon War was far from over. Powerful gods still ruled parts of the land and sea surrounding the region. And one of the most dangerous enemies Morax would ever face was waiting beneath the ocean itself. A massive sea god whose power could command storms and tidal waves. Its name was Ojal. And the battle between Morax and this ancient being would become one of the most legendary conflicts in Liyue's entire history. As the survivors of the Gili assembly moved south under the protection of Morax, the Archon War in Liyue continued to rage across the surrounding lands. The fall of the plains had not ended the conflict. If anything, it marked the beginning of an even more dangerous phase. Because by this point in the war, many of the weaker gods had already disappeared. Some had been defeated in battle. Others had abandoned their territories and faded into obscurity. The gods who remained were the most powerful ones. And that meant every confrontation carried enormous consequences. Each battle had the potential to reshape the balance of power across the entire region. Among the many threats that still existed around Liyue, one stood out above the rest. This enemy did not rule a mountain or a valley. It ruled the ocean itself. Deep beneath the waters off Liyue's coast lived a colossal sea god known as Ojal, often remembered in later stories as the overlord of the vortex. Unlike many land-bound deities who competed for territory during the Archon War, Ojal controlled the vast waters surrounding the region. Its presence made the sea unpredictable and dangerous. Storms could rise suddenly. Massive waves could swallow ships without warning. Even approaching the coastline could become deadly if the sea god's power stirred the waters. For the humans trying to rebuild their civilization near the coast, Ojal represented a constant threat. If Morax hoped to create a stable homeland for his people, the danger posed by the sea could not be ignored. Eventually, confrontation became inevitable. The battle between Morax and Ojal would become one of the most legendary events of the Archon War in Liyue. But like many ancient conflicts between gods, the details of the battle itself are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. What has survived through the centuries are fragments of stories and the physical evidence left behind. According to these legends, Morax confronted the sea god with overwhelming force. Rather than destroying Ojal outright, he chose to imprison it. Using immense geopower, Morax created enormous stone spears and drove them into the ocean, pinning the defeated god beneath the waves. These massive pillars of rock still stand today as the islands known as the Guyun Stone Forest. From a distance, they appear almost like the ruins of an ancient city rising from the sea. But according to Liyue's oldest stories, these formations are actually the remnants of the weapons Morax used during that battle. Beneath those waters, Ojal remains sealed even in the modern era of Genshin Impact. A defeated god buried beneath the sea. The defeat of Ojal marked an important turning point in the wars of Liyue. With the greatest threat along the coastline sealed away, the region surrounding the newly forming harbor settlement became far safer for human communities. But this victory did not mean that the Archon War in Liyue was over. Far from it. Because the land itself was still home to many powerful beings. Ancient monsters roamed the mountains. Spirits and illuminated creatures guarded hidden territories. And remnants of defeated gods sometimes lingered in the wild places of the world. Throughout this era, Morax was not fighting alone. Alongside him were the Adepti. These illuminated beings were ancient entities who possessed immense strength and deep connections to the land. Some of them took the forms of animals. Others appeared almost human. But all of them played an important role in protecting the people who had placed their trust in Morax. Among these allies were powerful figures such as Cloud Retainer, Mountain Shaper, and Moon Carver. These Adepti helped guard the mountains and valleys of Liyue while the war continued. Together with Morax, they fought to prevent rival gods or destructive forces from threatening the growing human settlements. Over time, this alliance between the Geo-Archon and the Adepti would become one of the defining features of Liyue's history. It was a partnership that allowed the region to survive one of the most chaotic periods in Teyvat's past. As the Archon War gradually moved toward its conclusion, the number of gods still active in Liyue continued to shrink. Some were defeated in battle. Others retreated from the region entirely. And some simply vanished from history as their influence faded. By the end of the conflict, it had become clear that only one divine ruler remained strong enough to claim the region. That ruler was Morax. When the Archon War finally ended and the divine order of the world was established, Morax was recognized as the Geo-Archon, the god who would rule Liyue. Under his guidance, the harbor settlement that had begun as a refuge for survivors slowly grew into a thriving center of trade and culture. Over the centuries, it would become one of the most prosperous cities in the world. The city known as Liyue Harbor. But while the wars of Liyue were drawing to a close, other parts of Teyvat were still locked in their own struggles for survival. Far across the sea, in a land made up of scattered islands and violent storms, another chapter of the Archon War was unfolding. A story centered around two divine sisters. Two gods whose bond would shape the future of their nation. Their names were Raiden Makoto and Raiden Ei, and their rise would determine the fate of the islands of Inazuma. Far across the sea from the mountains of Liyue lay a very different land. A chain of scattered islands surrounded by violent storms and restless waves. This region would one day become known as Inazuma. But during the age of the Archon War, the islands were not yet united under a single divine ruler. Like many other regions of Teyvat at the time, Inazuma was home to multiple gods who controlled different territories across the archipelago. Some ruled individual islands. Others commanded powerful natural forces such as storms, lightning, or the sea itself. The geography of the region made the conflict there especially unpredictable. Unlike the wide plains of Liyue or the open land surrounding Mondstadt, Inazuma was divided by water. Each island could become its own battlefield. Each stretch of ocean could separate allies from one another. And every god ruling the islands had to contend not only with rival deities, but also with the harsh environment itself. Storms frequently battered the coasts. Lightning storms could appear without warning. The seas between the islands were often treacherous to cross. In such a dangerous landscape, survival required strength, discipline, and careful planning. It was in this environment that two divine sisters began to rise to prominence. Their names were Raiden Makoto and Raiden Ei. Together, they would shape the future of the entire region. The two sisters were closely connected, yet their roles during the Archon War were very different. Raiden Makoto was known for her calm temperament and her desire to create stability in the world around her. She possessed a deep understanding of governance and believed in building a lasting order that could guide her people through uncertain times. Her younger twin, Raiden Ei, was very different. Ei was a warrior. While Makoto focused on leadership and vision, Ei devoted herself to mastering combat. She became known for her extraordinary skill with a sword and her immense control over electro power. In many ways, the sisters complemented each other perfectly. Makoto guided the future of their people. Ei protected that future on the battlefield. Together, they formed a partnership that would prove decisive during the Archon War. During this era, several powerful gods still ruled across the islands of Inazuma. Among the most notable of these deities was Orobashi, a massive serpent god who once controlled large parts of the archipelago. Orobashi was a powerful being with its own followers and territory. Its presence alone demonstrated how complex the divine balance of Inazuma once was. Unlike some regions where a single dominant god eventually emerged early in the war, the islands of Inazuma remained contested for a long time. Multiple deities struggled to maintain control over their domains. Some attempted to expand their influence by conquering neighboring islands. Others tried to secure alliances with powerful spirits or local populations. In this chaotic environment, the rise of the Raiden sisters gradually began to change the balance of power. While Makoto focused on establishing a stable foundation for governance, Ei fought relentlessly against rival gods and hostile forces threatening their territory. Her battlefield victories slowly expanded their influence across the islands. Each successful conflict strengthened their position. Each defeated rival brought them one step closer to becoming the dominant power in the region. Despite these victories, the war in Inazuma remained dangerous and unpredictable. Because the archipelago's many islands meant that enemies could appear from multiple directions. Even after one rival god had been defeated, another might still control a neighboring island. This meant that the struggle for control could continue for long periods of time, with shifting fronts and repeated conflicts. Throughout these battles, Raiden Ei became known as one of the most formidable warriors of the Archon War. Her mastery of lightning and her unmatched swordsmanship allowed her to defeat powerful enemies that might have overwhelmed other gods. Meanwhile, Raiden Makoto worked to bring stability to the territories they had already secured. Where Ei brought victory through strength, Makoto ensured that those victories would lead to lasting peace. Together, the sisters slowly united more and more of the islands under their protection. But the path to becoming the rulers of Inazuma was far from simple. Because even as their influence grew, powerful rivals still remained across the archipelago. And the final stages of the Archon War in Inazuma would involve some of the most dramatic confrontations in the region's history. Among these would be the legendary battle that would reshape one of the islands forever. A conflict that would leave behind a scar on the land itself. A scar that would later become known as Yashiori Island. As the Archon War continued across the islands of Inazuma, the influence of the Raiden sisters steadily expanded. Island by island, their power began to shape the region. Some territories willingly accepted their rule, recognizing the strength and stability the sisters offered. Others resisted. For many of the gods who still ruled parts of the archipelago, the rise of Raiden Makoto and Raiden Ei represented a direct threat to their authority. The Archon War left little room for compromise. As long as multiple gods remained in the region, conflict was inevitable. Among the most powerful of these rival deities was the great serpent god Orobashi. Orobashi ruled over its own followers and territory, commanding immense power. The serpent god was revered by many of the people living on certain islands, and its influence stretched across parts of the archipelago. Unlike many other gods who vanished quietly during the war, Orobashi would become part of one of the most dramatic conflicts in Inazuma's ancient history. But before that final confrontation occurred, the Raiden sisters continued consolidating their control across the region. During these years, Raiden Ei remained the primary warrior defending their expanding territory. Her mastery of lightning became legendary among both allies and enemies. Stories from this period describe battles where flashes of electro power split the sky and illuminated entire islands. These displays of strength were not merely acts of destruction. They were signals. Proof that a new power was rising in Inazuma. Meanwhile, Raiden Makoto focused on creating order in the lands they had already secured. She understood that victory in battle alone would not guarantee the survival of their nation. If Inazuma was to endure beyond the Archon War, it would need a stable foundation. Communities had to be protected. Trade had to continue. And the people living under their rule needed a sense of security in a world still filled with chaos. The sisters' partnership allowed them to pursue both goals at once. Ei ensured their enemies could not easily threaten them. Makoto ensured that what they built would last. Over time, this balance of strength and governance allowed the Raiden sisters to emerge as the dominant power among the islands. But one final confrontation would leave a permanent mark on Inazuma's history. The most famous battle associated with Raiden Ei took place against the serpent god Orobashi. This conflict would shape the fate of an entire island. The details of why the battle occurred are still debated among scholars of Inazuma's history. What is known is that the confrontation ended with Ei striking down Orobashi in a single devastating attack. The power of that strike was so immense that it split the island itself. The remains of the serpent god's enormous body were left scattered across the land that would later be known as Yashiori Island. Even thousands of years later, the skeletal remains of Orobashi can still be seen stretching across the island's landscape. The wound left by Ei's attack also created a deep scar across the land. This scar would later become the Muzujin Gorge, a massive valley that stands as a permanent reminder of the battle. For the people of Inazuma, this event became one of the defining legends of their history. It demonstrated the overwhelming power of the Raiden Shogun's blade, and it confirmed that the Raiden sisters had become the uncontested rulers of the archipelago. By the time the Archon War began approaching its end, Raiden Makoto stood as the recognized victor among the gods of Inazuma. When the divine order of the world was finally established, she became the Electro Archon. Her rule marked the beginning of a new era for the islands. Meanwhile, Raiden Ei continued to serve as her protector and closest ally. Together, the sisters would guide Inazuma into a period of stability that followed the chaos of the Archon War. But while the major conflicts in Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma had produced clear victors, other regions of Teyvat remained far more mysterious. Across the deserts and forests of Sumeru, within the waters of Fontaine, and somewhere within the volcanic lands of Natlan, their own struggles had taken place. The surviving records from these regions are far more fragmented, but they still tell us something important. Because even in places where the details have been lost, the Archon War still ended the same way. Only one god remained to claim each throne. While the wars in Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma left behind many detailed legends, the Archon War was never limited to those regions alone. Across the rest of Teyvat, similar struggles were unfolding. Gods were rising, gods were falling, and in every region, the same question hung over the conflict. Who would survive long enough to claim one of the 7 divine thrones? Unfortunately, the historical records from several of these regions are far less complete. Time, disaster, and the collapse of ancient civilizations have erased much of the detailed history from these battlefields. But even with these gaps, fragments of lore still allow us to glimpse how the Archon War shaped the rest of the world. One of the most mysterious regions during this period was Sumeru. Unlike Mondstadt or Liyue, where stories of individual battles survive through songs and legends, much of Sumeru's early divine history remains obscured. What we do know is that during the Archon War, numerous gods once existed across the region. Some ruled the great rainforests. Others held power over the vast desert that stretched beyond them. Among these ancient figures was a god whose story has become particularly well known in later eras. This was King Dishret, a powerful ruler associated with the desert civilization of ancient Sumeru. Unlike the Archons who would eventually emerge victorious, Dishret did not become one of the 7. Instead, his story would follow a very different path. Rather than conquering rival gods to claim a throne, Dishret eventually chose to pursue knowledge and power through other means. His later experiments with forbidden knowledge would have enormous consequences for the desert civilization he ruled. But those events took place long after the Archon War itself. During the war, Sumeru remained a land filled with competing divine forces, each struggling to secure their place in the new world order that Celestia seemed to be creating. Eventually, one god would emerge as the victor in the region. That god became known as Greater Lord Rukkhadevata. Her victory established the foundation of Sumeru's future as the Nation of Wisdom. Another region whose Archon War history remains largely hidden is Fontaine. The nation that would later become famous for its legal system and technological innovation must also have experienced its own divine conflicts during the Archon War. But compared to the records preserved in Liyue or Inazuma, very little direct information about these battles has survived. What we do know is that one god eventually emerged as the Hydro Archon. In earlier eras, This role was held by Egeria, an ancient deity who ruled Fontaine long before the modern age. Like the other Archons, Egeria's rise to power marked the end of the divine conflicts that once divided the region. But the details of those early battles have largely faded into mystery. The ruins scattered across Fontaine's landscape may hold clues about those ancient wars. Yet much of that history remains buried beneath centuries of change. To the west and south of the known nations lies another region whose Archon War history is even more obscure. This is the volcanic land known as Natlan. Compared to the other nations, very little detailed information about Natlan's ancient past has been revealed. What is known is that the nation eventually came under the rule of the Pyro Archon. But the identity of the earliest Pyro Archon and the specific conflicts that shaped Natlan during the Archon War remain largely unknown in surviving records. Given the region's association with battle and strength, it is likely that the wars there were just as fierce as those fought in other parts of Teyvat. But until more information emerges, the details of Natlan's ancient divine struggles remain one of the great mysteries of the Archon War. Despite these differences in recorded history, every region of Teyvat eventually reached the same conclusion. The number of active gods continued to shrink. The surviving deities grew stronger. And one by one, the victors of each region began to emerge. Across the entire continent, the chaotic age of countless competing gods was slowly coming to an end. Only 7 would remain. 7 rulers chosen from among the surviving divine powers. 7 thrones that would define the future structure of the world. And when the final battles of the Archon War were over, these victors would form a new system of divine authority. A system that would shape the history of Teyvat for thousands of years to come. After centuries of conflict, the Archon War finally began to draw to a close. Across the continent of Teyvat, the number of surviving gods had steadily decreased. Many had been defeated in battle. Others had disappeared from history as their followers scattered and their power faded. The long struggle that once involved countless divine rulers had slowly narrowed to only a handful of remaining contenders. By this point, the balance of power was becoming clear. Certain gods had already established dominance within their regions. In the north, the wind spirit who helped overthrow the storm tyrant had risen as the protector of Mondstadt. This god would come to be known as Barbatos, the Anemo Archon. In the mountainous lands of Liyue, the ancient warrior Morax had already secured his position after centuries of conflict and alliances with the Adepti. He would become the Geo Archon. Far across the sea in Inazuma, the rise of the Raiden sisters had reshaped the balance of power among the islands. When the war ended, Raiden Makoto would be recognized as the Electro Archon, with Raiden Ei continuing to stand beside her. Meanwhile, in Sumeru, the god who emerged victorious was Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, the original Dendro Archon. In Fontaine, the Hydro Archon of the era was Egeria, whose rule helped shape the early identity of the nation. The remaining thrones belonged to the Pyro Archon of Natlan and the Cryo Archon of Snezhnaya, though the details of their earliest reigns remain less clearly documented. Together, these 7 divine rulers became known as the 7 Archons. High above the world, the floating realm of Celestia recognized these victors. Celestia had observed the conflict that reshaped the world. And now, with only 7 gods remaining powerful enough to rule their respective regions, a new system of divine authority was established. Each of the 7 Archons was granted a gnosis. These mysterious objects symbolized their connection to Celestia and their position within the new divine order. With the 7 in place, the chaotic age of countless competing gods came to an end. For the first time in centuries, the world entered a period of relative stability. The Archon War had reshaped Teyvat completely. Entire civilizations had risen and fallen during the conflict. Landscapes had been permanently altered by divine battles. And many ancient gods had vanished forever. But from that destruction, a new structure emerged. 7 nations. 7 Archons. And a balance of power that would guide the world for thousands of years. For the people living in these newly formed nations, the end of the war brought a sense of relief that had not existed for generations. Cities could finally be rebuilt without fear that a divine battle might destroy them overnight. Trade routes could expand across the continent. Communities that had once lived in constant uncertainty began to stabilize under the protection of their Archons. But the legacy of the Archon War did not disappear entirely. The scars of that conflict remained scattered across the world. ruins left behind by fallen gods, landscapes shaped by ancient battles. Stories passed down through generations about the chaotic age when the gods themselves fought openly for control of Teyvat. Even in times of peace, those memories continue to influence how the people of each nation viewed their archons and the role those divine rulers played in their lives. For the archons themselves, victory in the war brought new responsibilities. Each now ruled a nation whose people depended on them for guidance and protection. The ideals these gods represented began to shape the identities of their respective lands. In Mondstadt, the ideal of freedom became central to the nation's culture under Barbatos. In Liyue, Morax established a society built around contracts, order, and commerce. In Inazuma, the Raiden shogun would guide the nation according to the concept of eternity. And in the other nations of Teyvat, their respective archons shaped their civilizations in different ways as the centuries passed. The Archon War had ended, but the age that followed would bring its own challenges. Because while the Seven Archons now ruled the world, there were still forces in Teyvat that existed beyond their control. Ancient powers hidden in forgotten ruins. Knowledge buried within the roots of the world itself. And far above everything else, the silent presence of Celestia continued to watch over the fate of the world. When the Archon War finally ended, the world entered a new and unfamiliar era. For the first time in centuries, the constant battles between gods came to a halt. The chaotic age when countless deities ruled small territories across Teyvat had passed. In its place, a new system had emerged. 7 gods now stood as the recognized rulers of the world. Each one governed a region that would eventually become one of the 7 nations. These nations would grow, evolve, and shape the history of Teyvat for thousands of years. But the transition from war to stability did not happen overnight. The Archon War had left deep scars across the land. Entire civilizations had been destroyed. Ancient cities lay buried beneath the earth. And many regions of the world were still struggling to recover from centuries of divine conflict. For the Archons themselves, victory brought not only authority, but also responsibility. Each now had to guide their people through the long process of rebuilding. In the windswept lands of Mondstadt, the newly risen Anemo Archon Barbatos chose a very unusual path. Rather than ruling the nation directly, Barbatos believed that the people of Mondstadt should govern themselves. After helping the humans overthrow the tyrannical storm god Decarabian, Barbatos had already witnessed the power of human determination. He believed that freedom should become the foundation of Mondstadt's identity. Instead of establishing a rigid divine government, Barbatos allowed the people to shape their own society. Over time, this decision would transform Mondstadt into a nation defined by independence and personal liberty. Even thousands of years later, the ideal of freedom remains central to Mondstadt's culture. In the mountainous nation of Liyue, the situation developed very differently. Here, the victorious Geo-Archon Morax took a far more active role in guiding his people. Morax had witnessed the destruction caused by the Archon War. He understood that stability and cooperation would be necessary if Liyue was to survive and prosper. To achieve this, he built a society centered around contracts. Agreements between individuals. Agreements between merchants. And agreements between the people and their god. These principles gradually shaped Liyue into a thriving center of trade and commerce. The harbor city that began as a refuge for survivors of the Gili Assembly eventually grew into the great trading port known as Liyue Harbor. Under Morax's guidance, the nation developed a culture that valued reliability, negotiation, and mutual trust. Across the sea, the islands of Inazuma also began rebuilding after the long years of war. There, the Electro-Archon Raiden Makoto became the official ruler of the nation. Her sister Raiden Ei continued to serve as her protector and closest ally. Together, the Raiden sisters worked to unify the islands and establish a stable government after the chaos of the Archon War. Makoto's rule was known for its balance and careful governance. Under her leadership, Inazuma gradually transformed into a structured and organized society. The islands that had once been divided by rival gods slowly came together under a single national identity. Elsewhere in Teyvat, the other Archons were also shaping the future of their nations. In Sumeru, the Dendro Archon Greater Lord Rukkhadevata guided her people toward a civilization centered around knowledge and scholarship. The pursuit of wisdom became the defining principle of the nation. In Fontaine, The Hydro-Archon Egeria presided over a culture that would eventually develop a strong focus on justice and law. Meanwhile, the nations of Natlan and Snezhnaya followed their own unique paths under their respective archons, though much of their earliest history remains less clearly recorded. For centuries, this new system of divine rule maintained a fragile balance across Teyvat. The seven archons each governed their regions, guiding their people according to their own ideals. And above them all, the floating realm of Celestia continued to watch over the world. But even during this era of relative peace, the deeper mysteries of Teyvat remained unresolved. Why had Celestia allowed the Archon War to occur in the first place? Why were only 7 gods permitted to rule the world? And what forces existed beyond the authority of the Archons themselves? Over the centuries, new conflicts and new revelations would begin to uncover answers to those questions. The fall of ancient civilizations, the rise of forbidden knowledge, and eventually, a catastrophe that would once again shake the foundations of the world. A disaster that would occur 500 years ago. The destruction of the underground nation of Kenria. But that is another story, and it would lead to the cataclysm that changed Teyvat forever. This was the full story of the Archon War, a conflict that reshaped the world. A war between gods that determined which ideals would guide humanity, and the beginning of the era that would eventually lead to the events of Genshin Impact itself. The Archon War may have ended long ago, but its consequences still echo across Teyvat to this very day.